My name is Daniel Reyes, and the night everything changed started with a bridge that kept collapsing on my kitchen table. Not an actual bridge, of course. A science fair bridge, the kind made from popsicle sticks, glue, and the absolute confidence of a 9-year-old boy who believed he could build anything if he just kept trying. My son, Matthew, sat across from me under the yellow kitchen light, staring at the latest wreckage of his project while I rinsed taco plates in the sink. "It keeps breaking in the middle," he said for the third time. "Every time I put the weights on it." I glanced over my shoulder. The bridge looked like every engineering failure in history, perfectly designed right up until reality arrived. "Where exactly does it break?" I asked. Matthew pointed. "Right here." I dried my hands and walked over. The center section had folded downward, but that wasn't where I was looking. I crouched beside the table and examined the joints where the support legs connected to the deck. One connection had already started separating. "The middle isn't your problem," I said. "It just looks like the problem because that's where you see it bending." He frowned. "Then what's the problem?" I tapped the joint lightly. "This is. Force doesn't care where people are looking. It goes where it wants to go." He studied the bridge again. "So I fix the joints?" "Always fix the joints." He nodded slowly, already thinking. Matthew had inherited that from me. Give him a problem, and he wouldn't stop pulling at it until he understood it. Sometimes I worried that would make his life harder. Most of the time, I hoped it would make him stronger. We spent another half-hour rebuilding the supports before my phone rang. I checked the screen and immediately knew it wasn't good. Nobody from work called me at 7:30 on a Tuesday night because things were going well. "Dad?" Matthew asked. "Work." He made a face. "Again?" I smiled apologetically and answered. Marcus didn't waste time with greetings. "Danny, I need you here." His voice sounded tight, too tight. "What's going on?" "Meridian Jet." That got my attention. Meridian wasn't just another charter company. They were one of the biggest private operators in the Southwest. Their aircraft were immaculate. Their standards were high. Their CEO was famous for never accepting delays. "What happened?" "We've got a dispatch issue on one of their aircraft. Ops wants another set of eyes before release." "What kind of aircraft?" There was a brief pause. Then Marcus answered, "Altair 700. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller. I didn't say anything. 9 years disappeared in a heartbeat. Conference rooms. Engineering reports. Arguments nobody wanted to hear. A memo buried inside a certification file. Marcus kept talking. "Danny, I'm here. Can you come?" I looked at Matthew sitting beside his half-finished bridge. Then I looked out the window into the dark Arizona evening. Somewhere across the city, an Altair 700 was waiting. I hadn't touched one in years. Not directly. Not since another life. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I'm coming." After hanging up, I called Rosa, my neighbor. She'd watched Matthew often enough that he practically considered her family. 20 minutes later, she arrived carrying a casserole dish and enough grandmother energy to manage an army. "Science fair?" she asked Matthew. "Bridge." "Ah." She nodded wisely. "Structural integrity." Matthew blinked. "You know about bridges?" Rosa smiled. "Honey, I raised 3 boys. I know about everything." I grabbed my jacket and keys. Before leaving, I bent down and kissed the top of Matthew's head. "Fix the joints," he grinned. "Fix the joints." I left before either of us knew how important those words were about to become. The maintenance facility sat on the far side of Scottsdale Municipal Airport, where private jets came and went at all hours. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt wrong immediately. Too much movement, too many people, too much tension. The giant hangar doors stood open under floodlights. Ground crews moved quickly. Pilots paced. Mechanics clustered in small groups. Everyone seemed to be watching the same aircraft. The Altair 700. Even from a distance, it was beautiful. Long-range business jet, sleek lines, twin engines mounted on pylons beneath the wings. One of the most successful aircraft programs of the last decade. I knew every inch of it, not because I'd maintained them, because years ago, I'd helped build one small part of them. Nobody here knew that, and I preferred it that way. Marcus met me near the hangar entrance, thank God. "What's the issue?" "Minor vibration flag during engine run-up." He handed me a clipboard. "Within limits, technically." I scanned the report. right engine, lateral vibration parameter, small exceedance, cleared after reset. Most inspectors would have signed it and gone home. Most inspectors weren't me. Who's pushing for release? I asked. Marcus laughed without humor. Everybody. He nodded toward the far end of the hangar. Standing beside the aircraft was a woman in a dark tailored coat speaking to 3 executives and a pilot. Even from 50 feet away, she radiated authority. That's Vivian Crane, Marcus said, CEO of Meridian. I recognized the name immediately. Aviation magazines loved her, investors loved her, employees feared her. What's so important about tonight? Marcus lowered his voice. 4 investors are flying to Aspen on that jet. Big demonstration. If the trip goes well, Meridian closes a financing round worth millions. I looked back at the aircraft. Suddenly the pressure made sense. The jet wasn't transportation tonight, it was a sales pitch, which meant every minute of delay cost money. Dangerous situation, not for the airplane, for the people making decisions about it. The chief pilot approached before I could ask anything else. Tall, silver-haired, expensive watch, the kind of man who had spent years being listened to. "You're the inspector?" he asked. Daniel Reyes. Grant Mercer. His handshake lasted exactly long enough to establish dominance. "The airplane is fine." I smiled politely. "Then this should be quick." He didn't smile back. "We've already checked the obvious causes." "Good. We're on a timeline. Aircraft usually are." That answer seemed to irritate him. "Good." Sometimes irritation revealed more than conversation. I reviewed the maintenance report again. Right engine, lateral vibration, small anomaly, within limits. The words sat wrong in my head, like a puzzle piece facing the wrong direction. "Show me the aircraft," I said. 20 minutes later, I was lying on my back beneath the right wing, flashlight in hand, creeper wheels squeaking against concrete. Everybody else focused on the engine. I didn't. The engine wasn't talking. Something else was. Years of experience taught me one lesson above all others. Symptoms matter. Causes matter more. I rolled farther beneath the wing and stopped near a section of fairing nobody usually opened during routine inspections. The maintenance manual didn't require it. Most mechanics never looked there. But I knew that area, better than anyone in the building. Slowly, I removed the first fastener, then another, then another. Metal clicked softly against the floor. Above me, the hangar hummed with nervous energy. Investors waited upstairs. Pilots checked watches. Executives calculated losses. Nobody paid attention to the man lying on the concrete beneath the airplane, which was fine. I preferred it that way. 5 minutes later, I loosened the final fastener and folded the panel downward. My flashlight swept across the structure hidden behind it, then stopped. For a moment, I simply stared. There it was, exactly where I knew it would be. A faint silver line catching the light, barely visible, maybe 4 centimeters long. Most people would have missed it completely. I didn't, because 9 years earlier, I'd sat in a conference room arguing about that exact piece of metal, and I had lost. My stomach tightened. Slowly, I reached out and touched the edge of the fitting. The crack caught my fingernail in both directions. Not a scratch, not surface damage. A crack. Real. Growing. Dangerous. Above me, footsteps approached. Then a woman's voice. Calm, controlled, powerful. "Mr. Reyes?" I slid out from beneath the wing and looked up. Vivian Crane stood there, up close. She looked even more impressive than the magazine suggested. Intelligent eyes, sharp posture, the kind of confidence money couldn't buy. "Yes?" She glanced at the aircraft, then at me. "Can this jet fly tonight?" I looked back toward the fitting hidden beneath the open panel, then I looked at her. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Vivian crouched slightly and lowered her voice. "If this aircraft takes off tonight, I'll make you rich." The hangar seemed to stop breathing. Everybody nearby went silent. She wasn't joking. She wasn't exaggerating. She meant it. Whatever number lived in my head, she was prepared to double it, triple it, maybe more, because hundreds of millions of dollars sat on the other side of tonight. I looked at the crack one last time, then I looked back at her. "Get everyone off the plane," I said. Nobody flies tonight. For the first time, Vivian Crane stopped looking like the most confident person in the building. And for the first time in 9 years, I realized the truth I'd spent nearly a decade trying to forget had finally caught up with all of us. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The hangar had been loud before. Not chaotic, but busy. Mechanics talking. Ground crews moving equipment. Pilots checking schedules. Executives making phone calls. Now it was silent. The kind of silence that only happens when everyone suddenly realizes something important has just happened and nobody knows what comes next. Vivian Crane was the first to recover. Explain. Her voice remained calm, but I could see the strain beneath it. She wasn't asking because she doubted me. Not anymore. She was asking because she desperately needed another answer. I understood. I wished I had one. Come here, I said. She hesitated for half a second before following me beneath the wing. Grant Mercer came too. So did Marcus. Tobias, the young mechanic who had performed the earlier inspection, hurried over from the opposite side of the aircraft. Within moments, 5 people stood around an open-access panel staring at a piece of metal that looked completely harmless. I pointed my flashlight toward the fitting. There. Vivian leaned closer. I don't see anything. Look where the light catches. Another second passed. Then her eyes narrowed. That line? Yes. Grant immediately shook his head. That's a scratch. I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I reached up and ran my fingernail across the line, then back the other direction. The nail caught both ways. Scratches don't do that. Grant's expression tightened. You can't ground an airplane over a scratch. Good thing I'm not. Tobias stepped closer. Is it really a crack? The kid sounded sick, not defensive, not embarrassed. Sick. That was actually a good sign. The mechanics who worried about missing things usually became excellent mechanics. The ones who shrugged scared me. Yes, I said quietly. It's a crack. Nobody spoke. Vivian looked from me to the fitting and back again. How serious? I took a slow breath. This was the moment that mattered. The moment where people decided whether to hear the truth or negotiate with it. That fitting carries structural load from the engine pylon. Meaning? Meaning the engine hangs from it. The silence deepened. How bad? She asked again. I looked directly at her. Bad enough that if this airplane belongs to me, nobody gets within 50 feet of it until we know exactly how far that crack goes. Grant folded his arms. You're making assumptions. No. I pointed toward the fitting. The crack is making assumptions. He didn't like that answer. Unfortunately, reality didn't care. Vivian looked toward the aircraft, then toward the terminal building where her investors waited, then back toward me. I could practically watch the calculations happening behind her eyes. Hundreds of jobs, millions of dollars, years of work, all balanced against a 4-centimeter crack most people couldn't even see. Finally, she asked the question I knew was coming. Could it make the flight? Nobody else breathed. I looked at the fitting again. Then I looked at her. Maybe. The word surprised everyone, including her. Maybe? Maybe it survives tonight. I shrugged. Maybe it survives another 100 flights. Then I paused. Or maybe it fails during climb-out over the mountains. Nobody liked that answer. Good. Honest answers rarely make people comfortable. Vivian stared at me for several seconds. Then she said something unexpected. You're not guessing. It wasn't a question. I met her gaze. No. Another long silence followed. Finally, Grant spoke again. We've got one inspector's opinion. No, I said. You've got one crack. I pulled out the maintenance logbook and flipped it open. The pen felt heavier than usual. Maybe because I knew what happened after I wrote the next sentence. There would be no going back. Not for the flight. Not for the company. Not for me. I began writing. Suspected fatigue crack. Right engine upper pylon attach fitting. Aircraft grounded pending non-destructive inspection. Return to service withheld. Then I signed my name. Daniel Reyes. Certificate number beneath it. When the pen left the page, the airplane became legally grounded. Nobody in that hangar could change that. Not Grant. Not Vivian, not the investors upstairs, not even me. The aircraft would stay exactly where it was until the inspection proved it safe, or proved me right. Tobias watched me sign. That's it? He asked quietly. That's it. The kid swallowed. I missed it. Maybe. He looked miserable. Definitely. No. I closed the logbook. You caught the vibration flag. He frowned. What? The vibration wasn't the problem. I pointed toward the fitting. It was the symptom. Tobias stared at the crack. Thinking. Learning. Connecting pieces. Exactly what I wanted. The engine shifted slightly because the fitting was weakening. Right. The vibration told us something was wrong. Right. His eyes widened, and I treated it like the problem instead of asking what caused it. I nodded. Now you're getting it. Marcus smiled faintly. Tobias looked relieved. The lesson hurt, but he'd remember it. Those are usually the best lessons. Across the hangar, Vivian pulled out her phone. Who do I call? I looked at her. Altair Aerospace. Grant laughed once. Short. Sharp. At 10 o'clock at night? Field service engineering never sleeps. I folded my arms. Trust me. She studied me carefully, then dialed. While the phone rang, I found myself staring at the aircraft again. Specifically at the fitting. Specifically at the place where the crack had formed. Exactly where I had predicted it would. 9 years. 9 years since I sat in a conference room, trying to explain why that fitting needed additional margin. 9 years since people with nicer offices told me the numbers were acceptable. 9 years since I filed a dissent memo nobody wanted to read. The memory hit harder than I expected. Maybe because I spent years convincing myself I was wrong. It would have been easier if I had been wrong. Vivian's conversation began quietly, then became less quiet, then suddenly stopped altogether as she listened. Her expression changed, slowly, subtly, the way someone's face changes when information starts rearranging their understanding of the world. Finally, she lowered the phone. Interesting. Nobody spoke. The engineer I reached asked one question before anything else. I already knew. Somehow I already knew. What question? Marcus asked. Vivian never took her eyes off me. He asked who found the crack. The hangar became very still. And? Grant asked. Vivian continued staring at me. I told him Daniel Reyes. Silence. Then he stopped talking for a moment. My stomach tightened. And after that? She folded her phone slowly. After that, he said. Another pause. If Daniel Reyes found it, then the crack is real. Nobody said a word. Tobias looked confused. Marcus looked confused. Grant looked annoyed. Vivian looked curious. Very curious. Who are you? She asked quietly. 9 years. 6 years working under airplanes. Thousands of inspections. Hundreds of nights convincing myself none of it mattered anymore. Yet somehow the past had just walked through the hangar door anyway. I looked back toward the Altair 700. Toward the crack. Toward the fitting. Toward the piece of metal that had changed my life once already. Then I took a slow breath. That's a longer story than you think. Vivian folded her arms. Good. The CEO glanced toward the grounded jet. Then, back at me, because nobody's flying anywhere tonight. For the first time all evening, I almost smiled. Vivian Crane reserved one of the executive conference rooms overlooking the hangar. By 11 o'clock that night, half the airport seemed to know something was happening. The investors remained at the terminal, the flight crew remained on standby. The Altair 700 sat motionless beneath the floodlights, while engineers from Altair Aerospace joined remotely through a secure video connection. I sat at one end of the table with a cup of terrible coffee and a growing suspicion that the evening was about to become much more complicated. Vivian sat across from me. Grant occupied a chair near the wall with the expression of a man who still believed the airplane should be flying. Tobias and Marcus stood near the back. On the large screen at the far end of the room appeared 3 engineers from Altair Aerospace headquarters. The oldest introduced himself first. David Okafor, Senior Director of Fleet Engineering. The moment I heard the name, I recognized it. David had been a systems engineer when I worked there. Smart. Honest. One of the few people who cared more about engineering than politics. His eyes settled on me immediately. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. Daniel. I nodded. David. The room noticed. Vivian especially. You've met. David laughed softly. That's one way to describe it. Nobody else understood the comment. Yet, Vivian folded her hands. Let's start with the airplane. Straight to business. One reason she'd become CEO. David nodded. We've reviewed the photographs. A series of images appeared on the screen. Close-ups of the cracked fitting. Measurements. Structural diagrams. Engineering models. Our preliminary assessment supports Mr. Reyes' conclusion. Grant shifted in his seat. Based on photographs? David turned toward him. Based on 20 years of structural engineering experience, silence followed. Grant didn't speak again. David returned his attention to the images. The fitting must undergo ultrasonic and eddy current inspection before any flight release is considered. Vivian leaned forward. How long? Best case? 8 hours. The room immediately became tense. 8 hours meant the investors weren't flying tonight. It meant contracts would be delayed. Meetings postponed. Money lost. David continued before anyone could object. Worst case? Nobody asked. He answered anyway. We find crack propagation beyond visible limits. Silence. Vivian looked toward me. How likely? I thought carefully before answering. More likely than I want it to be. Nobody liked that answer either. David nodded slowly. Agreed. For several minutes the discussion remained technical. Inspection procedures, maintenance requirements, structural loads, risk assessments, standard aviation language. Then David unexpectedly looked at me. Tell them. I frowned. Tell them what? His expression didn't change. The memo. Complete silence. Marcus looked confused. Tobias looked confused. Grant looked annoyed. Vivian looked very interested. What memo? She asked. David leaned back in his chair. 9 years ago, during certification testing for the Altair 700 program, Daniel raised concerns about that exact fitting. Nobody moved. Nobody even blinked. Vivian slowly turned toward me. That exact fitting? I stared at David. Thanks, David. Really appreciate that. David ignored me completely. Daniel's analysis suggested the design margin might not be sufficient under long-term fatigue loading. The conference room became very quiet. Tobias looked like someone had unplugged his brain. Grant stared. Marcus simply blinked repeatedly. Vivian never took her eyes off me. You worked on the Altair 700? I sighed. There it was. The question I'd spent years avoiding. A long time ago. Daniel. David's voice carried a warning. I knew that tone. He'd used it during engineering reviews when someone tried to dodge responsibility. Fine. I rubbed my forehead. Yes. More silence. How involved? Vivian asked. I considered lying, then remembered everyone in the room could probably verify the truth within 10 minutes. I was part of the structural certification team. Nobody spoke. Part? David laughed. Daniel wrote most of the fatigue modeling. Wonderful. Thanks again, David. The room somehow became even quieter. Vivian looked genuinely stunned. You're telling me the man crawling under airplanes tonight helped design this airplane? Formerly. I emphasized the word. A long time ago, Tobias finally found his voice. Then why are you working inspections? Fair question. Unfortunately, the answer wasn't simple. David looked away. He already knew where this conversation ended. So did I. Vivian waited patiently. Eventually I sighed. Because I lost. Silence. Lost what? She asked. I looked through the conference room window toward the hangar. The Altair 700 sat exactly where I'd left it. Floodlights reflected off its polished fuselage. Beautiful aircraft. Successful aircraft. Aircraft I'd once been proud of. The argument. Nobody understood. Yet. I folded my arms. 9 years ago, I argued the fitting needed redesign. David nodded. You did. Management disagreed. More silence. And? Vivian asked. And certification deadlines were approaching. That explained more than it should have. Every engineer in the room understood immediately. Schedules. Budgets. Timelines. The eternal enemies of caution. The design technically met requirements, I continued. The numbers worked. David sighed quietly. Barely. Barely. I nodded. But they worked. Vivian stared at me. You still objected? Yes. Why? I looked toward the aircraft again, then toward the crack photograph on the screen, then back at her. Because engineering isn't about whether something works today. Silence. It's about whether it still works 10 years from now. Nobody spoke. Even Grant seemed thoughtful. I continued. I wasn't worried about certification. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. I was worried about fatigue. David nodded again, repeated loading. Exactly. I pointed toward the fitting image. Thousands of flights, thousands of cycles, tiny stresses repeated over and over again. Another pause. Eventually, metal gets tired. The room remained silent. Tobias stared at the crack, suddenly seeing it differently. Not as a defect, as a story. A story that began 9 years earlier. Vivian folded her hands. What happened after you raised the concern? There it was. The question nobody wanted to ask. I smiled faintly. I became unpopular. A few people laughed. Nobody laughed for long. David's expression hardened. That's one way to describe it. I looked at him. He looked back. Neither of us needed to explain further. The truth sat between us anyway. Sometimes companies reward people for solving problems. Sometimes they reward people for keeping quiet about them. 9 years ago, I'd discovered which type of company Altair Aerospace had become. And before this night was over, everyone else in the room was going to discover it too. Nobody spoke for several seconds after I finished. The conference room overlooked the hangar through a wall of glass, and beyond it the Altair 700 sat under bright floodlights like a witness waiting to testify. 9 years of history had suddenly become relevant again. Unfortunately, history has a habit of bringing friends. Vivian was the first to break the silence. What exactly happened? I leaned back in my chair and stared at the coffee cup in front of me. Cold now. Bitter. Fitting, really. I wrote a dissent memo. Tobias frowned. A what? David answered before I could. A formal engineering objection. Tobias looked confused. David continued. When engineers disagree with a design decision, they can document their concerns for the certification record. Like leaving a paper trail? Marcus asked. Exactly. David nodded. It protects the engineer. He paused. At least that's the idea. Vivian looked directly at me. You filed one? Yes. And? I laughed softly. And nobody likes the person who slows down a billion-dollar aircraft program. The room became quiet again, because everyone understood that sentence. Maybe not the engineering part, definitely the billion-dollar part. Grant folded his arms. You're saying they ignored you? No. I shook my head. They listened. He looked surprised. Then what? Then they decided I was wrong. David looked like he wanted to argue with that phrasing. Eventually he sighed. That's not exactly what happened. I raised an eyebrow. Really? No. He rubbed his forehead. Actually, that's pretty close. Even Vivian almost smiled at that. David turned toward the rest of the room. Daniel's concern wasn't dismissed because the analysis was bad. Tobias frowned. Then why? David hesitated. The answer clearly annoyed him even now. Because the program was under pressure. There it was again. Pressure. The most dangerous force in aviation wasn't gravity. It was pressure. Pressure to meet schedules. Pressure to cut costs. Pressure to deliver promises somebody already made. David continued. Certification was approaching. Investors were watching. Airlines were waiting. He looked toward me. Management believed the risk was acceptable. And you didn't? Vivian asked. I looked through the glass at the airplane. No. Why? I took a slow breath. Because acceptable isn't the same thing as safe. Nobody interrupted. The fitting met minimum requirements. I nodded toward the crack image displayed on the screen. But minimum requirements assume ideal conditions. Another pause. Aircraft don't live ideal lives. David nodded. Weather, turbulence, hard landings. Exactly. I folded my arms. Metal remembers. Tobias blinked. Metal remembers? I smiled slightly. Every load. Every vibration. Every stress cycle. He looked back toward the photograph of the crack. Understanding slowly appeared. So every flight made it a little worse. Potentially. And after thousands of flights, you get tonight. Silence settled over the room. Vivian stared at the crack image for a long time. Then she looked at me. What happened after the memo? There it was, the real question. The one nobody wanted to ask. The one I'd spent years avoiding. I considered giving the short version. Unfortunately, the short version never explained anything. 3 months later, I wasn't on the project anymore. Tobias looked stunned. Marcus looked angry. Grant looked uncomfortable. David simply looked tired. They removed you? Vivian asked quietly. Officially? I shrugged. No. Unofficially? I smiled without humor. I suddenly stopped being invited to meetings. David closed his eyes briefly. He remembered. Then I got transferred. Another pause. Then transferred again. The room remained silent. Eventually I left. Tobias stared. Because of one disagreement? I looked at him carefully. No. Then I pointed toward the aircraft outside. Because some disagreements tell you who people really are. Nobody spoke after that. Even Grant seemed to be reconsidering something. Finally, Vivian stood and walked toward the glass overlooking the hangar. She remained there for nearly a minute, looking at the airplane, looking at the people working around it, looking at the consequences of decisions made long before she ever became CEO of Meridian. When she finally turned around, her expression had changed. The investors can wait. Grant frowned immediately. Vivian, she raised one hand, not aggressively, just enough. Grant stopped talking. The flight is canceled. Nobody argued. The aircraft stays grounded until inspection is complete. Still nobody argued. Then she looked directly at me. And if you're right? I held her gaze. Then we're lucky. Silence. Lucky? She repeated. I nodded toward the hangar. Because we found it here. The words landed harder than I intended. Everyone looked toward the aircraft. Everyone imagined the alternative. Mountains. Night. Passengers asleep in leather seats. Engines producing full thrust at 37,000 feet. A crack growing where nobody could see it. Vivian slowly folded her arms. How many people? She asked. I didn't need clarification. 13. Silence. Crew included. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Because for the first time all evening, the discussion wasn't about money, or schedules, or aircraft. It was about 13 people who almost boarded a flight they never would have questioned. A soft notification sound interrupted the silence. David looked down at something off-screen. Then his expression changed. Immediately. Daniel. I knew that look. Engineers only got that look for 2 reasons. Breakthroughs or disasters. What? David looked back up. I found your memo. The room became very still. 9 years disappeared again. Conference rooms. Arguments. Deadlines. Warnings. David's eyes remained fixed on me. It was archived. Silence. But it's still there. Vivian stepped closer. What does it say? David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened a file. Read silently for several seconds, then looked back at the camera. When he finally spoke, every person in the room felt the temperature change. It says. He paused. That fatigue cracking would likely appear between 8 and 12 years of service. Nobody breathed. Specifically. Another pause. At the right engine, upper pylon attach fitting. Complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound came from the distant hum of equipment in the hangar below. 9 years earlier. 8 to 12 years. Right engine. Upper pylon. Attach fitting. Exactly. Exactly. Tobias slowly sat down. Marcus stared at me. Grant looked pale. Vivian never took her eyes off the screen. David swallowed once. Then finished reading. Recommendation. Redesign fitting geometry before fleet-wide deployment. Another silence. Then one final sentence. Failure to address the issue may eventually result in structural cracking not detectable during routine inspections. The room stopped breathing. Because hidden inside an old archived memo was the truth. Not a theory. Not a guess. A prediction. And tonight, 9 years later, that prediction was sitting beneath the wing of an Altair 700 waiting for someone brave enough to admit Daniel Reyes had been right all along. Nobody said anything for nearly a minute. The conference room felt frozen in time. David Okafor's screen still displayed the scanned copy of my old descent memo. 9 years. 9 years sitting in an archive folder nobody cared about. 9 years collecting digital dust while airplanes flew thousands of hours carrying passengers who had never heard my name, and now every person in that room was staring at it like it had fallen from the sky. Tobias finally spoke first. "You predicted the exact failure?" I looked at the document on the screen. "Not exactly." He frowned. "That's literally the exact failure." "No." I shook my head. "I predicted a possibility." Silence. The crack still had to happen. Tobias looked confused. "Good. Confusion usually meant someone was learning." "Engineering isn't fortune-telling," I explained. "You don't predict events. You predict probabilities." David nodded immediately. "Exactly." Vivian remained standing near the glass overlooking the hangar. "What's the difference?" I looked toward her. "If I tell you a bridge might fail under certain conditions, and 10 years later it fails under those conditions, that doesn't make me a prophet." Another pause. "It means the conditions mattered." Nobody spoke. Because everyone understood what I wasn't saying. The conditions had mattered. And somebody had chosen not to change them. Grant suddenly pushed away from the wall. "Hold on." His voice sounded sharper than before. "We're talking about something that happened 9 years ago." Nobody answered. "The aircraft passed certification." Still nobody answered. "The design met requirements." David sighed quietly. "Here we go," Grant continued. "We're acting like somebody committed a crime." Vivian looked at him. "Didn't they?" Silence exploded across the room. Grant opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, then stopped. Because he didn't have a good answer, neither did anyone else. Vivian folded her arms. "A man identified a risk." She pointed toward the memo. "He documented it." Then she pointed toward the photograph of the crack. 9 years later, the risk appeared exactly where he said it would. Her voice remained calm, controlled, dangerous. "What exactly should I call that?" Nobody responded. David finally broke the silence. "It's more complicated than that." Vivian looked at him. "Is it?" David hesitated. "Yes." Then he sighed. "And no." Everyone waited. The aircraft was legal. He pointed toward the memo. The certification standards were satisfied. Another pause. But Daniel wasn't wrong. Tobias stared at the screen. Then why didn't they listen? Nobody answered immediately. Eventually, I laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. Because the answer was painfully ordinary. Because airplanes cost money. The room became quiet again. Deadlines cost money. Another pause. Design changes cost money. I pointed toward the crack image. And future problems don't feel real until they become present problems. Nobody argued. Because everybody in that room had seen it happen before. Different industries, different companies, same story. Vivian slowly returned to her chair. "How many people knew?" The question landed heavily. David looked away first. "A few." "How many?" David rubbed his forehead. "Enough." Silence. Vivian nodded slowly. Then she looked at me. "And you never told anyone?" I smiled faintly. Who would have cared? Nobody liked that answer. Especially because it was true. For 6 years, I'd worked inspections, crawled beneath aircraft, signed maintenance releases, raised my son, paid my mortgage, built a perfectly ordinary life. Nobody asked about old certification programs. Nobody asked about descent memos. Nobody asked about the career I'd left behind. And honestly, that was fine with me. "You just walked away?" Tobias asked. "Eventually." "Didn't that make you angry?" I looked toward the hangar. For a while, Tobias waited. "Then what?" I thought about Matthew sitting at home building bridges, about science fairs, baseball games, homework assignments, life, real life. Then I got busy. That answer confused him. It always did. People expect anger to last forever. Usually, it doesn't. Life gets in the way. David suddenly spoke again. "There's something else." The room immediately focused on him. He looked serious. More serious than before. "The maintenance history." My stomach tightened. "What about it?" David glanced down at his tablet. I pulled the records. Silence followed. 4 years ago, this aircraft experienced a hard landing event. Nobody moved. My pulse quickened. Hard landing. Exactly the kind of phrase engineers hate hearing. David continued. Overweight approach. Another pause. High descent rate. Another pause. Significant structural loads. The room became perfectly still. I already knew where this was going. David looked directly at me. The aircraft underwent inspection. Silence. And? Vivian asked quietly. David swallowed once. The inspection followed the standard maintenance manual. Nobody breathed. Which means? Tobias asked. I answered before David could. Nobody looked at the fitting. Complete silence. The realization hit everyone simultaneously. 4 years earlier, hard landing, maximum structural stress. Exactly the scenario I'd warned about. Exactly the scenario my memo described. Exactly the scenario capable of accelerating fatigue growth. And then the aircraft had been inspected according to procedures that never required anyone to open the fairing. Nobody checked the fitting. Nobody saw the crack beginning. Nobody knew. The room remained silent for several seconds. Then Vivian slowly leaned back in her chair. So let me understand this. Nobody interrupted. 9 years ago, Daniel warned about a failure mode. Another pause. 4 years ago, the aircraft experienced the exact event capable of triggering that failure mode. Another pause. And because the inspection procedure never changed, she looked toward the photograph. The crack continued growing until tonight. Nobody corrected her. Because nobody could. David finally nodded. That's essentially what happened. The conference room became silent again. Outside the glass wall, floodlights reflected across the aircraft's polished fuselage. Beautiful, expensive, dangerous. Vivian stared at the airplane for a long time. Then she looked back at me. Her expression had changed completely. The pressure was gone. The urgency was gone. Even the frustration seemed gone. What remained was something else. Understanding. You know what bothers me most? She asked quietly. I shook my head. The crack isn't what bothers me. Nobody spoke. It's the fact that it spent 4 years trying to tell us it existed. Silence. And nobody listened. For the first time that night, I realized Vivian Crane understood the lesson. Not the engineering lesson. The human one. The crack wasn't the problem. The problem was how many opportunities people had been given to find it. And before sunrise, we were going to learn just how close those missed opportunities had come to becoming a tragedy. Just after midnight, the Altair Aerospace Field Team arrived. 3 engineers, 2 technicians, and enough specialized equipment to turn a maintenance hangar into a forensic laboratory. The moment they walked through the door, the atmosphere changed. Up until now, we'd been dealing with opinions. Mine, Grant's, Vivian's, even David's. Opinions backed by experience, certainly, but opinions nonetheless. That phase was over. Now the metal would speak for itself. David Okafor was the first one through the hangar doors, gray-haired, calm. Carrying a tablet in one hand and a hard case in the other, he spotted me immediately and walked straight over. Daniel, David, he shook my hand firmly. I wish this wasn't the reason we were meeting again. I laughed softly. Same. He glanced toward the aircraft. But I have to admit. He paused. When they called me and said your name, I already knew what we were going to find. Vivian overheard that. So did Grant. Neither looked particularly comfortable. David walked beneath the wing and crouched beside the open fairing panel. For several seconds he simply stared at the crack. Then he nodded slowly. Exactly where you said it would be. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to say. The fitting already said it. One of David's technicians began preparing the area for dye-penetrant inspection. Tobias hovered nearby, watching every movement. Good. This was the kind of lesson they didn't teach in textbooks. The technician cleaned the metal carefully, removing every trace of dirt, grease, and residue. Then he sprayed a fluorescent penetrant across the fitting. The liquid looked harmless enough, bright red, under normal light. Almost beautiful. We waited while it seeped into every microscopic opening hidden inside the metal. Finally, the excess was removed, and a developer applied. Then the hangar lights were dimmed. The ultraviolet lamp switched on, and suddenly the crack came alive. Under UV light, the line glowed like green fire. Not 4 centimeters. Longer, much longer. What looked tiny under white light spread deeper into the fitting than anyone realized. The glowing line curved downward into the structure itself. Hidden damage, invisible damage, real damage. Tobias actually took a step backward. Oh my God. Nobody corrected him. David stared silently for several moments. Then one of the technicians ran an eddy current probe across the fitting. A monitor displayed the results in real time. Small waves became larger waves, then larger still. The technician's expression changed immediately, David noticed. How deep? Silence. The technician checked the readings again, then looked up. Past halfway. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words settled over the hangar like a storm cloud. Past halfway. Not surface damage, not cosmetic, structural, serious, potentially catastrophic. David slowly stood, then turned toward Vivian. Ma'am. His voice sounded different now. Formal, careful. This aircraft was not airworthy. Vivian stared at him. How bad? David looked toward the glowing crack, then back at her. If the fitting failed completely, the engine pylon would lose structural integrity. Silence. Meaning? She asked quietly. David didn't soften the answer, meaning the engine could separate from the wing. The hangar became perfectly silent. Somewhere in the distance, a vehicle moved across the ramp outside. Otherwise, nothing. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. Vivian looked toward the aircraft, then toward the crack, then back toward David. During flight? David nodded once. During flight. Another silence. Longer this time. He continued anyway. Under heavy loading. Another pause. Climb power. Another pause. Turbulence. Then finally the sentence nobody wanted to hear. There is a very real possibility the aircraft would have been lost. Nobody spoke, because there was nothing to say. 4 investors, 2 pilots, a flight attendant, several Meridian executives, 13 people, 13 names that would have become headlines. Vivian slowly lowered herself into a nearby chair. Not because she was weak, because the weight of that realization finally arrived. I was supposed to be on that flight. Her voice barely carried across the hangar. Nobody answered. She wasn't talking to us. She was talking to herself. I understood, because I was doing the same math. Every aviation professional does it eventually. The what-if math. The alternate timeline. The one where a decision goes the other way. The one where somebody signs a release. The one where a warning gets ignored. The one where a crack remains hidden. David finally broke the silence. You were lucky. I shook my head. No, everyone looked toward me. Lucky is finding money on the sidewalk. Silence. I pointed toward Tobias. He caught the vibration flag. Then toward Marcus. Marcus called me. Then toward Vivian. She listened. Another pause. That's not luck. Nobody spoke. Tobias looked down at the floor. The kid understood. He'd nearly dismissed the vibration as a sensor issue. But he didn't. Marcus could have told operations everything was fine. But he didn't. Vivian could have demanded a signature from someone else. But she didn't. Safety isn't usually one heroic decision. It's a chain of ordinary people doing the right thing when it's inconvenient. David smiled slightly. Still sounds lucky to me. Maybe he was right. Maybe both things could be true. Around 2 in the morning, while the inspection team continued documenting evidence, David pulled me aside. There's something else. My stomach tightened immediately. Engineers only say that when more bad news is coming. What? He handed me his tablet. Maintenance history. Fleet records. Structural reports. I scanned the screen. Then stopped. Hard landing event. 4 years earlier. Aircraft overweight. Excessive descent rate. Significant structural loading. Exactly the scenario I'd worried about 9 years ago. My stomach dropped. There it is. David nodded grimly. Yeah. Silence followed. I kept reading. Post-event inspection completed. Aircraft returned to service. Standard procedure followed. Standard procedure. The phrase felt like a punch to the chest, because standard procedure never required inspection of the fitting hidden beneath that fairing. The exact change I'd requested. The exact change management rejected. The exact change that could have caught the crack years ago. David watched me carefully. Daniel. I looked up. What? His voice softened. You weren't wrong. For 6 years, I told myself that maybe I had been. Maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe I'd made a career-ending fight over a problem that never would have happened. Maybe all those people were right. Maybe I was just difficult. Now a glowing green crack sat beneath a wing, proving otherwise. And somehow that felt worse than being wrong ever would have, because being right came with consequences. 13 people almost boarded a flight tonight. And before the sun rose over Arizona, the entire aviation industry was about to discover why. By sunrise, the story had already escaped the hangar. Aviation has its own version of a small town. Pilots talk, mechanics talk, inspectors talk. Nobody intends to spread news, yet somehow everyone hears it anyway. By 6 o'clock that morning, people across 3 states knew an Altair 700 had been grounded because of a structural crack. By 7 o'clock, rumors were multiplying faster than facts. By 8 o'clock, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. I ignored most of the calls, not because I didn't care, because I knew what was coming next. Investigations, reviews, questions. Lots of questions. The problem with questions is that sometimes they lead to answers people don't want. I was sitting at a folding table inside the hangar, eating a stale breakfast sandwich, when David walked over carrying another tablet. His expression immediately told me something had changed. How bad? I asked. David sat down across from me. Potentially very bad. Great. Exactly what every engineer wants to hear before breakfast. He slid the tablet across the table. Fleet data filled the screen. Hundreds of aircraft. Flight hours. Maintenance records. Inspection histories. After we confirmed the crack, he said, Altair issued an internal fleet review. I stared at the numbers, then at the highlighted rows, then back at David. No, he nodded once. Yeah, my stomach tightened. 5 aircraft, then 8, then 12, all carrying similar operating profiles, similar service histories, similar loading events, similar maintenance records, the same fitting, the same design, the same potential failure mode. Silence stretched between us. Confirmed? I asked quietly. Not yet. David rubbed his eyes. But concerning enough that we're sending inspection teams immediately. I looked toward the grounded Altair 700 sitting across the hangar. 24 hours ago, it had been 1 aircraft. 1 problem. 1 crack. Now it was becoming something much larger. David leaned back. FAA's involved. Of course they were. Already? Already. Another silence followed. Neither of us seemed surprised. This wasn't a paperwork issue anymore. It was a fleet issue. Potentially a worldwide fleet issue. The distinction mattered. A lot. Across the hangar, Vivian Crane was speaking with 2 reporters who had somehow gained access to the airport perimeter. Security was attempting to remove them politely. The reporters were resisting politely. Aviation journalism in action. David followed my gaze. She's handling it well. I nodded. Better than most would. Vivian had every reason to be angry. The investors never reached Aspen. Contracts were delayed. Shareholders were asking questions. News helicopters were literally circling above the airport. Yet somehow she remained focused on the only thing that mattered. Nobody got hurt. Not everyone in business understood that priority. She did. My phone buzzed again. This time I answered. Hello? Silence. Then a voice I hadn't heard in almost 8 years. Daniel. I froze. David noticed immediately. Who's that? He mouthed. I ignored him. Mark. The name tasted strange after all this time. Mark Ellison. Former vice president of certification programs at Altair Aerospace. One of the men who sat across from me during the meetings 9 years ago. One of the men who signed the final approval package. One of the men who told me the risk was acceptable. Silence lingered between us. Finally, Mark spoke again. I saw the reports. I stared at the floor. I'm sure you did. Another pause. Then something happened that I never expected. You were right. No excuses. No explanations. No qualifications. Just 4 words. You were right. For years I'd imagined this conversation. Hundreds of times. Usually it ended with me angry. Usually it ended with him defensive. Reality felt different. Smaller. Sadder. I rubbed a hand across my face. 13 people almost boarded that airplane. Silence. I know. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Tired too. Mark. I stopped, because suddenly I didn't know what to say. Anger had faded years ago. Resentment too. What remained wasn't rage, just disappointment. Eventually he spoke first. I'm retiring next month. I blinked. Okay. Another pause. I thought you should hear it from me. Silence. Hear what? The answer arrived quietly. I should have listened. The words hit harder than the apology. Because they weren't about engineering. They were about something larger. Pride. Pressure. Ego. All the things that convince smart people they don't need to hear uncomfortable truths. I looked toward the aircraft again. Toward the crack. Toward the chain of decisions stretching back nearly a decade. Yeah, I said softly. You should have. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he surprised me one final time. The memo never left my desk. I frowned. What? After you left. His voice tightened. I kept it. Silence. Why? Another pause. Because part of me thought you might be right. I closed my eyes. For a moment, exhaustion hit me harder than anything else had. Not because of the crack. Not because of the investigation. Because of how close we'd come. Not once. Repeatedly. 9 years of opportunities. 9 years of warnings. 9 years of chances to ask one more question. Goodbye, Daniel. I opened my eyes. Goodbye, Mark. The line disconnected. I sat there for a long time staring at nothing. Finally, David spoke. You okay? I laughed softly. No idea. Fair answer. Around noon, the FAA arrived. 3 investigators. 2 engineers. 1 legal advisor. The aviation equivalent of a storm front. They interviewed everyone. Mechanics, pilots, maintenance, supervisors. Me, especially me. The questions lasted hours. Yet one question appeared more than any other. How did you know where to look? Every time, I gave the same answer. I didn't know where to look. I knew where to listen. The vibration flag wasn't the problem. It was the clue. The crack wasn't hidden. It was communicating. The aircraft spent years trying to tell people something. The challenge wasn't finding the answer. The challenge was paying attention. Late that afternoon, another message arrived from Altair Aerospace. David read it first, then smiled. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, he actually smiled. You'll want to see this. He handed me the tablet. I scanned the report, then read it again. Then a third time. 4 additional aircraft had already undergone emergency inspection. 3 showed early-stage cracking in the exact same fitting. Not catastrophic yet, not dangerous yet, but developing, growing, following the same path. The same prediction, the same warning. 9 years later, my warning hadn't saved 1 airplane. It had just identified a fleet-wide problem before it became a fleet-wide tragedy. David watched my reaction carefully. Daniel? I looked up. What? He smiled. I think the industry's about to remember who you are. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Because sometimes being remembered means reliving everything you'd rather leave behind. And before this investigation was over, the entire aviation world was going to learn the story of the engineer who warned everyone 9 years too early. By the 3rd day, the story was everywhere. Aviation news sites picked it up first, then national business networks, then mainstream media. Reporters loved simple narratives, and this one practically wrote itself. A grounded jet, a hidden structural crack, a single inspector who found what everyone else missed. The problem was that reality wasn't simple. Reality never is. I was reminded of that Friday morning when I walked into my workshop and found 3 news vans parked outside. Marcus nearly spilled his coffee laughing. Congratulations. I stared through the window. On what? Apparently you're famous. I groaned immediately. That's not how fame works. Tell that to the reporters. Sure enough, a woman holding a microphone spotted me and started moving toward the door. I retreated deeper into the building. Marcus laughed even harder. Coward. Professional survival instinct. Same thing. Unfortunately, hiding wasn't really an option anymore. Around noon, the FAA held its first official briefing. I watched from the break room television alongside half the mechanics in the building. David Okafor stood beside several FAA officials as they outlined the preliminary findings. 4 additional Altair 700 aircraft had already been inspected. 3 contained early-stage cracking in the same fitting. Additional inspections were underway across North America, Europe, and Asia. The numbers were still small. The implications were not. One FAA engineer pointed toward a structural diagram displayed on a screen. At this time, there is no evidence of imminent fleet-wide danger. Everyone relaxed slightly. Then he continued. However, we believe early intervention prevented a potentially serious safety issue from developing further. The room became quiet again. Mechanics understood what that sentence really meant. Translation. We got lucky. My phone buzzed before the briefing even ended. The caller ID surprised me. Vivian Crane. Hello. Are you busy? I looked around the workshop. Marcus was pretending not to eavesdrop. Tobias was absolutely eavesdropping. Depends. I need a favor. That got my attention. CEOs rarely ask favors. They usually issue instructions. What kind of favor? Silence. Then Vivian said something unexpected. Would you come to the estate? Why? Another pause. Because I owe some people an explanation. 2 hours later, I found myself standing inside Meridian Jet Group's headquarters. The boardroom overlooked downtown Phoenix through floor-to-ceiling glass. 12 board members occupied expensive chairs around an even more expensive table. Every one of them looked tired. Investors had questions. Regulators had questions. Shareholders had questions. Nobody enjoys answering questions when aircraft are involved. Vivian stood at the front of the room. Calm. Composed. Completely in control. Before we begin, she said, there's someone I'd like you to meet. Every head turned toward me. Wonderful. Exactly where I wanted to be. Vivian ignored my discomfort completely. This is Daniel Reyes. Silence followed. A few people recognized the name immediately. Most did not. Vivian continued. 3 nights ago, Daniel prevented one of our aircraft from departing. She paused. At the time, that decision cost us millions of dollars. More silence. Then she smiled slightly. Today, I believe it saved much more than that. Nobody spoke. The board members weren't stupid. They already knew the story. They simply hadn't heard it framed that way before. Vivian turned toward me. Would you explain? I considered refusing. Then I remembered 13 passengers. So I did. For 20 minutes, I walked them through everything. The vibration flag. The inspection. The crack. The fitting. The memo. The history. The fleet findings. No drama, no speeches. Just facts. When I finished, the room remained silent. Finally, one elderly board member leaned forward. Mr. Reyes. Yes? If the aircraft had departed, I already knew the question. We don't know exactly what would have happened. Silence. But we know enough. The man nodded slowly. Then another board member spoke. And you found this because of a vibration report? Yes. She blinked. That's all? I smiled faintly. That's never all. Confusion crossed several faces, so I explained. The vibration wasn't important because it was large. It was important because it was unusual. Small clues matter. Small changes matter. Most failures announce themselves long before they become disasters. The trick is listening when they're still whispering. The room grew very quiet after that. Eventually, the meeting ended. People shook hands, asked questions, thanked me more than I felt comfortable with. Then, as everyone began leaving, one board member lingered behind. Older, silver hair, thoughtful eyes. You know, he said quietly, most people would have signed the release. I looked toward the city skyline outside. Maybe. He shook his head. No. Silence. They would have. Another pause. Because most people don't want to be the reason something gets delayed. I thought about that. Then about Matthew's bridge sitting on our kitchen table. Then about the crack beneath the wing. That's the wrong way to look at it. The man frowned. How so? I smiled. I wasn't the reason it got delayed. Silence. The crack was. He stared at me for several seconds, then laughed softly. Fair point. As I left the building, Vivian caught up with me in the parking garage. Thank you. I looked at her. For what? For reminding them what matters. I shrugged. Airplanes? She laughed. People. We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Then she surprised me. I spoke with the FAA this morning. My stomach tightened. And? She smiled. They're considering a formal commendation. I immediately groaned. Vivian laughed. That bad? Much worse. Why? Because then people will expect speeches. Her laughter echoed through the garage. For the first time in days, the situation felt almost normal. Almost. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Matthew. A photo appeared on the screen. His science fair bridge, finished, standing proudly on the kitchen table beneath a stack of heavy textbooks. The caption read, "Fixed the joints." I stared at it for several seconds before smiling. Vivian noticed immediately. Your son? I nodded. Science project. She looked at the photo, then at me. Looks sturdy. I laughed softly. That's the idea. Neither of us realized it yet, but Matthew's little bridge and a cracked aircraft fitting had something important in common. Both were about foundations. And before this story ended, I was going to discover that rebuilding a career was a lot easier than rebuilding a life. 3 weeks after the crack was discovered, my life became significantly more complicated. Not because of the FAA investigation, not because of the media attention, not even because Altair Aerospace had launched the largest structural inspection program in the company's history. No, the complication arrived in the form of a 9-year-old boy carrying a blue ribbon through my front door at 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon. First place. Matthew shouted before I could even stand up from the kitchen table. The ribbon hit my chest a second later. I looked down. First place. Elementary Engineering Division. Matthew looked like he'd just won the Super Bowl. Well? He demanded. Well, what? Aren't you impressed? I stared at him. Matthew, you built a bridge that survived 37 pounds of textbooks. His grin widened. 39. 39? Mrs. Harper added 2 more. I nodded solemnly. In that case, this may be the greatest engineering achievement in modern history. He laughed and threw his backpack onto a chair. Then his expression changed. You weren't there. The words hit harder than I expected, not because he sounded angry, because he sounded disappointed. There is a difference. Anger fades. Disappointment stays longer. I looked away briefly. I know. Silence. The FAA meeting? He asked. Yeah. He nodded slowly. Okay. Which somehow made me feel worse, because kids are often more understanding than adults deserve. That night, after dinner, I sat alone on the back porch, while Matthew worked on homework inside. Arizona sunsets have a way of making everything look peaceful, whether it is or not. My phone buzzed. Vivian Crane, I answered. Hello, what are you doing? I glanced through the window toward the kitchen, feeling guilty. Silence. Then Vivian laughed softly. Specific enough. I smiled despite myself. My son won first place at the science fair today. Another pause. And you missed it? Yeah. She understood immediately. No explanation required. How bad? She asked. I thought about Matthew's face. About the blue ribbon. About the word okay. Bad enough. Vivian didn't speak for several seconds. Then she surprised me. My father missed my first robotics competition. I blinked. Really? National finals. Her voice softened. I spent 6 months preparing. Silence followed. What happened? I asked. Vivian laughed once. Not because it was funny. Board meeting. Of course. Some stories repeat themselves across generations. Did you forgive him? I asked quietly. Another long pause. Eventually, then her voice became softer still. But that's not the memory I kept. The answer lingered between us, because we both understood exactly what she meant. Sometimes people think they're sacrificing small moments for important responsibilities. Then years pass and they realize the small moments were the important responsibilities. The next morning, I received an email from the FAA, then another, then 3 more. By lunchtime, my inbox looked like a disaster area. Marcus walked into the office carrying printed reports. You should sit down. I frowned. That's never a good opening sentence. He handed me the papers. Fleet inspection summaries. Aircraft registrations, structural findings. I scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. My stomach tightened. 12 confirmed cracks. Worldwide. 12. Aircraft in the United States, Canada, Germany, Japan, Australia. Different operators, different flight profiles. Same fitting. Same location. Same failure mode. Silence filled the office. Marcus pointed toward the report. You realize what this means? Unfortunately, I did. My memo hadn't identified a theoretical issue. It had identified a real one, a global one. Every new inspection reinforced the same conclusion. The crack on Meridian's aircraft wasn't unique. It was simply the first one discovered. The others had been flying around the world unnoticed. The realization was terrifying and strangely humbling. My phone rang again. David Okafor. Tell me you've got good news. David laughed. Depends. Not promising. Go ahead. FAA is preparing an airworthiness directive. I closed my eyes. Wow. Airworthiness directives are not casual documents. They are mandatory. When the FAA issues one, aircraft operators don't debate it. They comply. Immediately. You're serious. Very. Another pause. The draft references your original analysis. I didn't answer right away. For several seconds I simply stared at the inspection reports covering my desk. 9 years. 9 years ago, people treated the memo like an inconvenience. Now federal regulators were using it as the foundation for a fleet-wide safety directive. Life has a strange sense of humor, David continued. There's more. Of course there was. What? Altair's board wants to meet you. I actually laughed. No, Daniel. No, hear me out. Absolutely not. David sighed dramatically. You're impossible. Learned from the best. Silence. Then David laughed too. Eventually he won the argument, mostly because he refused to stop calling. 3 days later, I found myself walking through the front doors of Altair Aerospace headquarters for the first time in nearly a decade. Some places feel smaller when you return. This one didn't. The lobby looked exactly the same. The hallways looked exactly the same. Even the smell felt familiar. Memory is strange that way. A young receptionist escorted me toward the executive conference floor. Along the way, employees glanced up from workstations. Some recognized me, most didn't. That was fine. The conference room waiting at the end of the corridor looked expensive enough to launch satellites from. Floor-to-ceiling glass, city views, polished wood. The entire executive board sat around the table, including people I'd never met, including a few people I wished I had never met. Then I saw something unexpected. Framed on the screen behind them was a photograph of the cracked fitting. Beneath it appeared a simple sentence. Listen early. The room became quiet as I entered. Finally the chairman stood. Mr. Reyes. I nodded. Sir. He gestured toward an empty chair. Please. I sat carefully. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then the chairman surprised me. We owe you an apology. Complete silence. Real apologies are rare. Corporate apologies are practically mythical. Yet there it was. Simple, direct, uncomfortable. Exactly the way apologies should be. I wasn't prepared for it, and somehow that made it feel genuine. What I didn't know yet was that this meeting wasn't about the past. It was about the future. And before the day ended, Altair Aerospace was going to offer me something I never expected to receive again. I expected a presentation, maybe a legal statement, possibly a carefully crafted corporate apology reviewed by 3 attorneys and 6 public relations consultants. What I did not expect was honesty. The chairman remained standing for several seconds after speaking. The rest of the board stayed silent. Nobody rushed to fill the space. Nobody softened the moment. We owe you an apology. The words hung in the room. Real apologies are uncomfortable. That's how you know they're real. Finally, I leaned back slightly. For what? The chairman looked surprised by the question. Good. He should have been. For not listening. I nodded slowly. That's part of it. Silence followed. Several board members exchanged glances. One woman near the far end of the table spoke first. What do you mean? I looked toward the photograph of the cracked fitting displayed on the screen. The problem wasn't that you disagreed with me. Nobody interrupted. Reasonable people disagree all the time. Another pause. The problem was that nobody asked what would happen if I was right. Complete silence. The chairman sat down. The woman nodded slowly. She understood. The distinction mattered. Engineering isn't about being correct. It's about understanding consequences. 9 years earlier, everyone focused on probabilities. Nobody focused enough on outcomes. Eventually, the chairman folded his hands. Fair. Then he sighed. Very fair. For the next hour, the discussion remained surprisingly candid. No corporate language. No legal gymnastics. Just facts. The fleet inspections had expanded dramatically. 27 aircraft now showed varying levels of cracking. None had progressed as far as Meridian's aircraft, thankfully. But every new inspection reinforced the same conclusion. The original concern had been valid. One board member reviewed the numbers. If the crack on Meridian's aircraft hadn't been discovered, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. Eventually, the chairman closed the report and looked directly at me. David tells me you've spent the last 6 years performing inspections. I nodded. Mostly. Do you miss engineering? Interesting question. I thought about it carefully. About the years before Matthew was born. About design reviews, flight testing. Endless meetings. Endless arguments. Endless spreadsheets. Then I thought about the last 6 years. Maintenance hangars, inspections, practical problems, real airplanes, real people. Sometimes, I said honestly. The chairman smiled slightly. Good. That answer immediately made me suspicious. Why? Several board members laughed. Apparently, I wasn't difficult to read. The chairman slid a folder across the table. Because we'd like to offer you a job. There it was. I stared at the folder. Didn't touch it. Didn't open it. Just stared. No. The room erupted in laughter. Even the chairman laughed. You haven't read it. Don't need to. Daniel. David sounded exhausted already. At least look. I sighed dramatically. Then opened the folder. The title alone made me blink. Director of Structural Integrity and Fleet Safety. Silence. I read it again. Then continued reading. The position carried authority across every engineering division. Direct reporting access to executive leadership. Independent review authority. Mandatory dissent review procedures. Mandatory escalation procedures. Mandatory long-term risk assessments. I stopped halfway through. Wait. The chairman smiled. Keep reading. I did. The position had been created 3 days earlier. Specifically because of what happened with the Altair 700. Specifically because of the crack. Specifically because nobody wanted a repeat. I looked up slowly. This didn't exist before. No. You created an entire department. Yes. Silence followed. Because of one crack? The chairman shook his head. No. Another pause. Because of one voice. The room became quiet. I wasn't prepared for that answer. Nobody is. David leaned forward. Daniel, I looked toward him. What? The industry needs people willing to be unpopular. Several board members nodded immediately. David continued. Most engineers can solve problems. Another pause. Far fewer are willing to stand in a room full of executives and tell them something they don't want to hear. The room remained silent. Because everybody knew that was the real issue. The crack wasn't special. The memo wasn't special. The difficult part was refusing to stay quiet when staying quiet would have been easier. Eventually, I closed the folder. I have a son. The chairman nodded. We know. He's 9. We know. I missed his science fair last week. Silence. Nobody interrupted. Good. Because this mattered. I spent years convincing myself career wasn't the most important thing anymore. Another pause. I meant it. The chairman nodded again. Good. That wasn't the answer I expected. Good? Absolutely. He folded his hands. The last thing we want is someone willing to sacrifice everything for a job. Complete silence. We've already seen how that story ends. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Richard, Mark, hundreds of executives, thousands of professionals. The pattern wasn't exactly rare. The chairman continued. Take the folder home. I already said no. Take it home anyway. More laughter spread around the table. Apparently my reputation had arrived before I did. The meeting ended an hour later. No pressure, no deadlines, no ultimatums, just a folder tucked beneath my arm as I walked toward the parking lot. The Arizona afternoon felt warmer than usual, or maybe I was simply tired. My phone rang before I reached my truck. Matthew. Hey buddy. Dad? Yeah? Excitement exploded through the speaker. Guess what? I smiled immediately. What? Mrs. Harper wants my bridge in the district showcase. I laughed. That's awesome. You can come this time, right? The question hit harder than any job offer, harder than any apology, harder than any board meeting, because none of those things really mattered if I got that answer wrong. I looked down at the folder under my arm, then toward the horizon beyond the parking lot, then back toward my truck. Yeah, I said quietly. I'll be there. Silence, then a huge grin in his voice. Promise? I smiled. Promise. After hanging up, I sat inside the truck for several minutes without starting the engine. The folder rested on the passenger seat beside me. 6 years ago, I would have accepted the offer immediately. 9 years ago, I would have considered it a dream job. Today felt different, because success means something different when someone is waiting for you at home. What I didn't know yet was that Matthew was about to solve the problem I hadn't even realized I was struggling with. And when he did, the answer would be simpler than any engineering problem I'd ever faced. I expected a presentation, maybe a legal statement, possibly a carefully crafted corporate apology reviewed by 3 attorneys and 6 public relations consultants. What I did not expect was honesty. The chairman remained standing for several seconds after speaking. The rest of the board stayed silent. Nobody rushed to fill the space. Nobody softened the moment. We owe you an apology. The words hung in the room. Real apologies are uncomfortable. That's how you know they're real. Finally, I leaned back slightly. For what? The chairman looked surprised by the question. Good. He should have been. For not listening. I nodded slowly. That's part of it. Silence followed. Several board members exchanged glances. One woman near the far end of the table spoke first. What do you mean? I looked toward the photograph of the cracked fitting displayed on the screen. The problem wasn't that you disagreed with me. Nobody interrupted. Reasonable people disagree all the time. Another pause. The problem was that nobody asked what would happen if I was right. Complete silence. The chairman sat down. The woman nodded slowly. She understood. The distinction mattered. Engineering isn't about being correct. It's about understanding consequences. 9 years earlier, everyone focused on probabilities. Nobody focused enough on outcomes. Eventually, the chairman folded his hands. Fair. Then he sighed. Very fair. For the next hour, the discussion remained surprisingly candid. No corporate language, no legal gymnastics. Just facts. The fleet inspections had expanded dramatically. 27 aircraft now showed varying levels of cracking. None had progressed as far as Meridian's aircraft, thankfully. But every new inspection reinforced the same conclusion. The original concern had been valid. One board member reviewed the numbers. If the crack on Meridian's aircraft hadn't been discovered, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. Eventually, the chairman closed the report and looked directly at me. David tells me you've spent the last 6 years performing inspections. I nodded. Mostly. Do you miss engineering? Interesting question. I thought about it carefully. About the years before Matthew was born. About design reviews, flight testing, endless meetings, endless arguments, endless spreadsheets. Then I thought about the last 6 years. Maintenance, hangars, inspections, practical problems, real airplanes, real people. Sometimes, I said honestly. The chairman smiled slightly. Good. That answer immediately made me suspicious. Why? Several board members laughed. Apparently I wasn't difficult to read. The chairman slid a folder across the table. Because we'd like to offer you a job. There it was. I stared at the folder. Didn't touch it, didn't open it, just stared. No, the room erupted in laughter. Even the chairman laughed. You haven't read it. Don't need to. Daniel. David sounded exhausted already. At least look. I sighed dramatically, then opened the folder. The title alone made me blink. Director of Structural Integrity and Fleet Safety. Silence. I read it again, then continued reading. The position carried authority across every engineering division, direct reporting access to executive leadership, independent review authority, mandatory dissent review procedures, mandatory escalation procedures, mandatory long-term risk assessments. I stopped halfway through. Wait. The chairman smiled. Keep reading. I did. The position had been created 3 days earlier, specifically because of what happened with the Altair 700, specifically because of the crack, specifically because nobody wanted a repeat. I looked up slowly. This didn't exist before. No, you created an entire department. Yes. Silence followed. Because of one crack? The chairman shook his head. No. Another pause. Because of one voice. The room became quiet. I wasn't prepared for that answer. Nobody is. David leaned forward. Daniel. I looked toward him. What? The industry needs people willing to be unpopular. Several board members nodded immediately. David continued. Most engineers can solve problems. Another pause. Far fewer are willing to stand in a room full of executives and tell them something they don't want to hear. The room remained silent, because everybody knew that was the real issue. The crack wasn't special. The memo wasn't special. The difficult part was refusing to stay quiet when staying quiet would have been easier. Eventually, I closed the folder. I have a son. The chairman nodded. We know. He's 9. We know. I missed his science fair last week. Silence. Nobody interrupted. Good. Because this mattered. I spent years convincing myself career wasn't the most important thing anymore. Another pause. I meant it. The chairman nodded again. Good. That wasn't the answer I expected. Good? Absolutely. He folded his hands. The last thing we want is someone willing to sacrifice everything for a job. Complete silence. We've already seen how that story ends. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Richard, Mark, hundreds of executives, thousands of professionals. The pattern wasn't exactly rare. The chairman continued. Take the folder home. I already said no. Take it home anyway. More laughter spread around the table. Apparently my reputation had arrived before I did. The meeting ended an hour later. No pressure, no deadlines, no ultimatums, just a folder tucked beneath my arm as I walked toward the parking lot. The Arizona afternoon felt warmer than usual. Or maybe I was simply tired. My phone rang before I reached my truck. Matthew. Hey, buddy. Dad? Yeah? Excitement exploded through the speaker. Guess what? I smiled immediately. What? Mrs. Harper wants my bridge in the district showcase. I laughed. That's awesome. You can come this time, right? The question hit harder than any job offer, harder than any apology, harder than any board meeting, because none of those things really mattered if I got that answer wrong. I looked down at the folder under my arm, then toward the horizon beyond the parking lot, then back toward my truck. Yeah, I said quietly. I'll be there. Silence. Then a huge grin in his voice. Promise? I smiled. Promise. After hanging up, I sat inside the truck for several minutes without starting the engine. The folder rested on the passenger seat. 6 years ago, I would have accepted the offer immediately. 9 years ago, I would have considered it a dream job. Today felt different, because success means something different when someone is waiting for you at home. What I didn't know yet was that Matthew was about to solve the problem I hadn't even realized I was struggling with. And when he did, the answer would be simpler than any engineering problem I'd ever faced. Matthew solved the problem on a Saturday morning while wearing mismatched socks and eating pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, which, if I'm being honest, was exactly how most important discoveries seem to happen, not in conference rooms, not in board meetings, not in places where people expect them. I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing the Altair offer for what felt like the 100th time. The folder remained open beside my coffee. Position details, responsibilities, salary figures that made Marcus threaten to adopt me if I turned them down. Everything about the offer made sense on paper, which was precisely why I couldn't make a decision. Matthew dropped into the chair across from me, carrying a stack of science magazines. "You're doing the thing again." I looked up. "What thing?" "The staring thing." "Fair. I'm thinking." Matthew nodded. "Looks painful." I couldn't argue with that either. He pointed toward the folder. "The airplane job?" "Maybe." "You don't want it?" "Maybe." "You do want it?" I sighed. "Maybe." Matthew laughed. "Adults are weird." "That's fair." Silence settled over the kitchen for a moment. Then he surprised me. "What happens if you take it?" I leaned back. "I'd help make airplanes safer." He nodded. "Good. I'd probably travel more." Another nod. "Okay. Longer hours." He thought about that. "Not as good. More meetings." He actually winced. "Definitely not good." I laughed. Then Matthew asked the question that mattered. "Would you still come to my stuff?" Silence. There it was. The entire problem reduced to 6 words. Would you still come to my stuff? Not salary, not prestige, not title, not career advancement, just presence, showing up, the thing most people convince themselves they'll do later. I looked at him carefully. "That's what you're worried about?" Matthew shrugged. "Kind of." Another pause. Mom used to come to everything. The words hit harder than he realized. Claire had come to everything. Soccer games, school plays, science fairs, parent nights. She treated every event like it mattered. Because to her it did. I stared down at the folder, then at my son, then back at the folder again. Suddenly the answer felt obvious. Not easy. Obvious. Later that afternoon, I drove to Scottsdale Airport. David Okafor was waiting inside a conference room overlooking one of the maintenance hangars. The moment he saw my expression, he smiled. "You already decided?" I sat down across from him. "Yeah." "No?" I laughed. "How did you know?" David leaned back. "Because if the answer was yes, you'd look excited." "Fair point." "Disappointed?" he asked. I considered the question honestly, then shook my head. "No." Silence followed. "Relieved?" "That one was closer. Maybe." David nodded slowly. He understood better than most. We spent several minutes talking about the fleet inspections, the FAA directive, the repair program, the engineering changes already being implemented across the Altair fleet. Real work. Important work. Then eventually he looked at me again. "You know they're going to be disappointed." I smiled faintly. "They'll survive." David laughed. "Probably." Another silence. Then I surprised both of us. "I do want the job." David frowned. "What?" "I want the work." I pointed toward the reports spread across the table. "I care about this stuff." He nodded. "I know. I always will." Another pause. "But I don't want the version of the job they're offering." David stared for several seconds. Then a slow smile appeared. "Ah, exactly. The position wasn't the problem. The structure was. The assumptions were. The expectation that commitment must automatically mean sacrifice. That success must automatically require absence. That good work and a good life couldn't coexist. I was tired of that equation." David sat quietly for a moment, then laughed. "You're about to make executives very uncomfortable." "Probably. Good." We both laughed. 3 days later, I found myself back at Altair headquarters. Same boardroom. Same executives. Same city skyline. Different conversation. The chairman smiled when I entered. "Daniel." I sat down. "Sir." He folded his hands. "Have you reached a decision?" "Yes." Silence. Every executive in the room focused on me. I placed the folder on the table. "I won't accept the position." Nobody looked surprised. "Not really." Maybe they'd already guessed. The chairman nodded slowly. "Okay." I blinked. "Okay?" He laughed. "You seem disappointed by that response." "Fair point." Then he leaned forward. "Tell me what you actually want." The room became quiet. Very quiet. Because suddenly the conversation changed. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a design problem. My favorite kind. I took a breath. "I want authority without permanent bureaucracy." Several people smiled. "I want to work on safety." Another pause. I want to mentor younger engineers. Another pause. I want time to raise my son. Silence followed. The chairman nodded thoughtfully. Anything else? Yes. I smiled faintly. I want people to listen when somebody raises a concern. The room remained quiet. Then, slowly, the chairman smiled. Now that's a job description. By the end of the meeting, nobody had signed anything. No contracts, no announcements, no titles, yet somehow we were closer to an agreement than before. Because for the first time, we weren't discussing a position. We were discussing a purpose. That evening, I arrived home just in time to help Matthew prepare for the district science showcase. His bridge sat proudly on the dining room table, surrounded by notes, diagrams, and enough glue to violate several safety regulations. You made it. He looked genuinely relieved. Told you I would. Good. Then he paused. What happened with the airplane people? I looked at him, then smiled. We're still figuring it out. Matthew nodded thoughtfully. That's okay. Yeah? Yeah? He pointed toward his bridge. Good designs take time. I stared at him for several seconds, then laughed. Because somehow, without realizing it, a 9-year-old had just summarized the entire lesson. Good designs take time, good airplanes, good careers, good companies, good families. None of them happened by accident. And the next day, standing inside a crowded exhibition hall filled with students showing off science projects, I was finally going to understand what success actually looked like. The district science showcase occupied the gymnasium of a local middle school on the north side of Phoenix. Hundreds of students, hundreds of projects, hundreds of parents carrying coffee and cameras while pretending not to be more nervous than their children. In other words, complete chaos. My kind of chaos. Matthew stood beside his bridge wearing the same expression I'd seen before every baseball game, every school presentation, and every challenge he'd ever decided mattered. Focused, determined, slightly terrified. I recognized it because I used to wear the exact same expression. You'll be fine, I told him. Easy for you to say. Why? You've already done hard stuff. Fair point. I smiled. So have you. He looked toward the bridge, then toward the judges walking across the gym, then back toward the bridge again. Maybe. The competition lasted most of the morning. Students explained designs. Judges asked questions. Parents tried very hard not to interfere. By noon, everyone looked exhausted. Matthew had presented his bridge 4 separate times. The structure held. The calculations checked out. The judges seemed impressed. More importantly, he enjoyed himself. That mattered most. We were eating sandwiches in the cafeteria when my phone buzzed. David Okafor. I answered immediately. Tell me you've got good news. David laughed. Depends. Same answer as always. Go ahead. The FAA directive becomes official tomorrow. I nodded. Okay. Fleet-wide inspections completed. Silence. And? David's voice softened slightly. 34 aircraft. I froze. 34 airplanes carrying the same developing issue. 34 opportunities to discover the problem before it discovered someone else. No accidents? I asked quietly. None. Relief flooded through me so quickly I almost laughed. None. That was the only number that mattered. David continued. Repair program starts immediately. Another pause. And the board approved the proposal. I frowned. What proposal? David sounded far too pleased with himself. The one you accidentally designed. I laughed. That's not reassuring. You'll survive. Then he explained. Instead of creating another executive position, Altair Aerospace was establishing an independent engineering review council. Small, focused, separate from production schedules and certification pressures. Engineers could raise concerns directly without navigating management layers. Long-term safety reviews would become mandatory. Dissent analyses would receive formal responses. Most importantly, nobody would be punished for asking uncomfortable questions. Silence followed. Daniel? David asked. I stared across the cafeteria at Matthew, laughing with another student beside his bridge. Yeah? You changed the company. I shook my head. No. You did? No. I smiled faintly. The crack changed the company. David laughed softly. Still doing that, huh? Maybe I was. redirecting credit, looking at systems instead of individuals, focusing on causes instead of praise. Old habits, not all of them bad. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. Then Matthew appeared carrying a bottle of lemonade. Good news? Pretty good. He nodded. Cool. Then he sat beside me. No further questions, no dramatic curiosity, just trust. The kind kids give you when they believe you'll tell them what matters. Several hours later, the awards ceremony began. Students gathered in folding chairs. Parents lined the walls. Teachers attempted to create order from chaos. Predictably, chaos won. Eventually, the principal stepped onto the stage. Categories were announced, awards distributed. Applause echoed through the gym. Then the engineering division arrived. Matthew sat a little straighter. I pretended not to notice. The principal smiled. This year's District Engineering Award goes to a project demonstrating exceptional structural design, practical testing, and creative problem-solving. A pause, then a name, Matthew Reyes. The gym exploded with applause. Matthew froze. Completely froze. For half a second, he looked genuinely shocked. Then reality caught up with him, and he practically sprinted toward the stage. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. Parents around me cheered. Teachers smiled. Cameras appeared everywhere. The normal miracle of watching a child realize they can do something difficult. Matthew accepted the award with both hands, then immediately looked into the crowd. Looking for me, I waved. He grinned. And in that moment, every board meeting, every inspection, every late-night phone call, every difficult conversation felt very small by comparison. Because this was the thing people accidentally miss while chasing other things. The moment, the memory, the reason. Later that evening, after the celebration ended and the award sat proudly on our kitchen counter, Matthew looked at me across the dinner table. Dad? Yeah? He pointed toward the trophy. This is kind of because of you. I laughed. No. He frowned. Why do you always do that? Do what? The credit thing. Fair question. I thought about it, then smiled. Because good things usually belong to more than one person. Matthew considered that carefully, then nodded. Okay. Another pause. But you helped. Yeah. I smiled. I helped. That answer seemed acceptable. Good. A few weeks later, the FAA formally issued its airworthiness directive. Inspection requirements became mandatory worldwide. Repair kits shipped to operators across 6 continents. Industry conferences discussed the case. Engineering schools studied it. Safety seminars referenced it. The phrase "listen early" appeared on presentation slides from Seattle to Singapore. The lesson spread far beyond a single aircraft. And somehow that felt right. Months later, I accepted a consulting role with the new Engineering Review Council. Not full-time, not executive, not the version of success I would have chosen 10 years earlier. A better version. One that allowed me to help solve important problems without missing the things that mattered most. On a warm spring evening nearly a year after the crack was discovered, Matthew and I visited Scottsdale Airport. The repaired Altair 700 sat outside a hangar glowing beneath the setting sun. Beautiful. Safe. Ready. We stood beside the fence watching ground crews prepare it for another flight. So that's the airplane? Matthew asked. That's the airplane. Silence followed. Then he smiled. Looks normal. I laughed. That's kind of the goal. Another pause. People will never know. I looked toward the aircraft. Know what? How close they came. The question surprised me, because it was exactly the kind of thing an engineer would ask. I thought about it carefully before answering. Maybe not. Then I smiled. And that's okay. Matthew frowned. Why? I rested a hand on his shoulder, because the best safety stories are the ones nobody ever has to hear. The aircraft taxied slowly toward the runway. Passengers sat comfortably inside, probably checking emails, reading reports, or planning vacations. Completely unaware of the crack that almost changed everything. Completely unaware of the mechanic who noticed a vibration flag. The inspector who asked one more question. The engineers who finally listened. Exactly as it should be. The jet accelerated, lifted smoothly into the evening sky, climbed west toward the horizon. Safe. Strong. Whole. Matthew watched until it disappeared. Then he looked up at me. Fix the joints? I laughed. Fix the joints. He grinned. I grinned back, and together we headed home. The end.